Britain, we tend to remember our dead collectively through the war memorials that probably all of us are familiar with in villages, towns and cities. Almost every village in Britain has a war memorial. Largely they date back to the end of the First World War, sometimes earlier, but they're collective lists of the dead. And of course, the main way that we as a nation remember the war is through the ceremonies on Remembrance Sunday in November every year. Now, Remembrance Sunday is the Sunday closest to the original armistice, the First World War, on the 11th of November, and we remember the dead then through ceremonies at local war memorials, but also through the national ceremony and also the Commonwealth ceremony at the Cenotaph in London. But what we remember there is not the individual dead, it's the glorious dead. It's a collective of the glorious dead. And I think this idea of the glorious dead kind of hides an awful lot of the important detail around death in war. And it also perhaps makes the war's dead particularly vulnerable to manipulation, perhaps by politicians, by other social groups who might have ultimate aims that don't necessarily align with the original war aims that people died for. When we remember the First World War, literally all we think about in this country is the dead. They're absolutely at the heart of the memory of the First World War. But when we think about the Second World War, they're almost entirely absent. And I became really interested in this very different way of remembering the two wars and went off to research death and grief in the Second World War. And what I found was a kind of a big gap. If you like, there's public advice to people all through the war. If you're bereaved, if you're grieving, keep that to yourself. Don't share it. Throw yourself into the war effort. And that's how you'll get over it. And if you go out looking sad, if you grieve in public, then that'll be really bad for morale. But of course people grieved. They often kept that to themselves. They might have written about it privately in letters and diaries, and we can find those traces of grief there. And what I really wanted to do was to remember that and to make that really important central element of war visible. I think it's really important that we know, as far as we can, the truth about real lived experiences of war, including experiences of death and grief and the stuff that we don't particularly like to remember. I think if we can find a way to remember war in all its kind of human messiness, it makes it far more difficult for people to manipulate that memory and to say there should only be one memory of a war, only one way of thinking about this, because it does get claimed by particular political groups. This is why history is really, really important, and we need to embed a historical understanding of our past in society. I think ideally the way that we remember wars would be far more complex, would not just be focused around war memorials and one day a year. It would be kind of embedded in lots of different sites of public life in education, whether that's through schools, whether that's through universities, whether it's through museums. And for example, the Imperial War Museum's new Second World War gallery has lots of individual stories of war threaded through that. And I think it's really important that we remember that war is about individuals, and I think we owe it to them to do that.